Prime Ministers, Excellencies, and distinguished participants, thank you very much for this chance to present and discuss the World Development Report 2009, Reshaping Economic Geography. I'm going to take about 15 minutes of your time to explain the report's motivations, its main messages, and some of its policy implications. This is a report about geography, and as such, the World Development Report 2009, or WDR as we call it, is essentially on the importance of place for prosperity. So what I like to do is to start presentations with a quick look at three very special, prosperous places. The first is Tokyo. It's the largest city in the world with 35 million people, more than a quarter of Japan's population packed into less than 4% of its total land area. The second special prosperous place is the United States, the largest economy in the world, and not coincidentally, also where the population is the most mobile, where about 35 million people change residences every year. The third special prosperous place is Western Europe, the most connected continent in the world today, but bitterly divided not so long ago, where countries now trade about 35% of their GDP and more than half of that among their neighbors. Here are some pictures. Here's a fairly old picture of a densely packed train station in Japan. And here is a more recent one of people being crushed into trains by professional trained packers. Those are the gentlemen in uniforms with the white gloves. Despite the passage of time and progress in transportation and communication technology, this picture hasn't changed much. This map of Japan's economic density shows you why. Tokyo generates a big part of Japan's wealth. To get a share of it, people have to live close by. The most striking feature of this map is the concentration of wealth in the Tokyo and Yokohama corridor. It is economic density, the first of three fundamental dimensions of economic geography that we use in the WDR. Now take a look at what happens in the United States every Thanksgiving on the last Thursday in November. These are all the planes in the air on the Tuesday before that holiday as about 35 million Americans try to get back to their families and friends. It's the heart of winter in some places of the U.S., so flights are often canceled, causing scenes like this across the country. But Americans put up with the pain of leaving friends and family because economic activity is concentrated in a few parts of the country, in the northeast and the southwestern coasts. So if you want to be part of this wealth, you have to move to get closer to get it. And this is why 8 million Americans change states every year, migrating to reduce their distance to economic opportunity. The most striking feature of this map is the second of our more fundamental dimensions, economic distance. Across the Atlantic in Western Europe, you see another massive movement, but not of people this time, but that of products. This map shows the places where Airbus makes parts of planes and assembles them, in Germany, Britain, France, Spain, and in other countries. You see planes being loaded onto planes as places specialize in making different parts and producing them in scale. You see countries in a region that was bitterly divided taking the risk of trading with former enemies to become a more perfect integrated European Union. This map shows the thickness of borders between countries in Western Europe and contrasts those with Africa. As Europe has integrated economically, these economic divisions between countries have come down, making specialization and production at scale possible. The most striking feature of this map is economic division, the third of our fundamental dimensions, which is very, very high in Africa and low in Western Europe. So what is the payoff of all of this pain? Densely packed cities, a mobile population migrating to great distances, and enemies risking to trust each other to overcome divisions. This map of the economic geography of the world resizes the area of a country to reflect its GDP. And what it shows is the benefits of big cities, mobile populations, and connected countries. The US, Western Europe, and Japan dominate the world economy. This seems depressing to people concerned with development, and it would be, but for one thing. These stories are now being repeated in Asia and other parts of the world that are prospering and capturing everybody's attention. Mumbai is not the largest city in the world, but it is the most densely populated, and it keeps on growing. China is not the largest economy in the world, but it is the fastest growing and may be among those where the population is the most mobile. Southeast Asia may not have formed the formal economic and political union as Western Europe has, but it trades in parts of goods back and forth, just like the Europeans do. And here are some more pictures. You can see stuffed trains in Mumbai with people risking loss of life and limb to take advantage of economic density. You can see millions of Chinese workers migrating from the interior and the northwest to get closer to economic opportunity, which is concentrated along the southeastern coast. And just as Americans travel during Thanksgiving holiday, 200 million Chinese travel during the Chinese New Year every year. This is a scene from a crowded bus station as this annual migration, the largest human migration in annual migration around the world, was disrupted in 2008 by ice storms. And despite these difficulties, the migrants were back at bus and rail stations again in 2009. East Asia may not trade in airplane parts, but its countries that were once very divided and enemies now trade in parts of cars, computers, and televisions with the same frequency, speed, and often the volume as those in Europe. And what is the payoff of this more recent pain? If we look again at this map of the economic contours of the world, you can start to recognize the shape of China, India, and Southeast Asian countries again on this map. And contrast this with Africa, which shows up here as a slender peninsula and not as the mighty land continent that it is in reality. The World Development Report argues that these places are doing well because they have promoted the spatial or geographic transformations that are necessary for progress. These changes can be measured along the three dimensions of which I spoke. Higher densities, as seen in the growth of cities, shorter distances as workers and businesses migrate closer to that density, and fewer divisions as countries thin their economic borders and access world markets to take advantage of scale and specialization. Some countries, like the US and Japan, reshaped their economic geography along these lines in the past, and some, like China and India, are reshaping it now. The WDR proposes that these will be the changes that will help developers in other parts of the world to prosper. And it provides a common framework for reframing three policy debates on urbanization, on territorial development, and on regional integration of the world's country neighborhoods. The report examines the most important policy issues of economic geography, from the local to the national to the international scales of geography. And here is a map that shows what I mean. The challenge for local policymakers in Shanghai is how to manage better the rapid process of urbanization. The challenge of national policymakers in China is how to manage the disparities in resources and in living standards between the lagging Northwest and the booming southeastern coasts. And the challenge for the leaders of countries in East Asia is how to make a better economic union that benefits all countries, from the well-connected to the landlocked and indeed to the sea-locked. So as we go from the national to the local to the national and then to the international scale, the specific policy issue changes, but the underlying problem is the same. Some places do well and others do not, and this is difficult for anyone to accept. The main messages of the WDR are that economic production and growth will be unbalanced and will concentrate more and more in certain prosperous places. Indeed, to try to spread out this economic activity is to discourage it. But development, despite this reality, can still be inclusive, in that even people who start their lives far from economic opportunity can benefit from growing concentration of wealth in just a few places. And the way to get the benefits of both uneven growth and inclusive development is through economic integration. The report makes it very, very clear what is meant by economic integration. It means one thing to integrate rural and urban areas and slums with prosperous parts of cities. It means quite another thing to integrate lagging and leading territories within a country. And it means yet a thing altogether different to integrate isolated with well-connected countries. But there is one thing that is common to the policy debates in all three areas at all three scales. In their current form, they overemphasize spatial targeting. What to do in slums, what to do in lagging states or remote areas, and what to do in the most poor or landlocked countries. In the WDR, we call for a rebalancing of these policy discussions to include all of the instruments of integration: institutions that unify, infrastructure that connects, and interventions that target spatially. And what we do is we develop a common conceptual framework to show how the three dimensions, density, distance, and division, can be used to tailor these policy instruments to address the particular challenge of integration that is posed by geography, from the most simple challenge to the most difficult integration challenge. And what I've done here is I'm going to forward through the slides and take us directly to the part of the discussion that's the most of greatest interest to this forum, which is that of regional integration. The diagnostic tools of density, distance, and division can be used to identify the geographic challenges to growth at the local, national, and international spatial scale, as I've mentioned. So what we do is we use this framework to classify world regions by the difficulty of the economic integration challenge for countries in these regions. So the common problem when we go to the international scale is one of division. Thick economic borders. It's not so much borders that are a problem, but badly managed borders. Borders that create obstacles to the flow of ideas, of capital, of people, and of goods. But beyond this common problem of economic division, the challenges differ. As discussed earlier, economic mass in the world today is concentrated internationally in three major world markets: North America, Western Europe, and Northeast Asia, essentially in Japan. This is where economic density, the second dimension that we use, is greatest. But by also examining distance, we are able to identify international world neighborhoods by different types. This map shows countries and regions that are closer to these main world markets. They appear here in darker shades of green. And it also shows those that are very far from these world markets, both physically and in terms of economic costs from these largest markets. Here, these are colored, these faraway places are colored in lighter shades. As shown in the magnified portion of the map, the Baltic region is fortunate in its proximity to one of these three main world markets, and indeed, by the high degree of integration that it already enjoys. Here, we have categorized this region and other world regions into three types. The first type are countries and regions that are close to these world markets, such as Central America, Central and Eastern Europe, including those, of course, of the Baltic region, and the island nations of the Caribbean, here colored in blue. They face a relatively easy challenge of integration, that of building common institutions that will help them to become extensions of the large market to which they are a neighbor of. Countries and regions that are distant from these three main world markets, on the other hand, but which have a large home market, here we've colored them in green, face a more difficult integration challenge. But good institutions and regional infrastructure can help them to access these markets. And examples are East Asia and increasingly South Asia. But Southern Africa, South America, can also integrate globally by making their home markets bigger and more specialized, by investing in common regional institutions and infrastructure. But the integration challenge is the most difficult for countries and regions that are divided by borders, that are distant from the main world markets, and that lack the economic density provided by a large local economy. And here we've shown these areas in red. These are the regions and countries that Paul Collier refers to as the bottom billion: East, Central, West Africa, Central Asia, and the Pacific Islands. For these countries, all three instruments are needed for integration. Common regional institutions that thin borders, regional infrastructure that connects countries, and spatially targeted initiatives that target the less fortunate countries. Based on this analysis, the WDR proposes a simple rule for addressing the constraints posed by economic geography. The objective is economic integration. The principle is that as the dimensions of the challenge increase, the number of policy instruments that should be brought to bear should also increase. Take a look at this table. Regardless of whether you're looking at the problems of economic geography locally, nationally, or internationally, when considering how better to integrate countries into a closer economic neighborhood, the rule remains the same. Start with common institutions that ensure that everyone benefits, and ensure that everyone benefits from these. Be more selective about where to invest in connective infrastructure, and be the most selective about where to use targeted interventions to encourage economic activity where it would not come up if just left to the market. The rule of thumb is an eye for a D. If policymakers follow this simple rule, they will encourage economic growth. According to this conceptual toolkit, the Baltic region clearly is faced with the most straightforward, but perhaps the most difficult geographic challenge of integration. With respect to today's major markets, it is what we call a 1D region. It just has to deal with this issue of division, essentially, where the integration strategy needs to prioritize development of common institutions. The process of closer European economic union is already accelerating the development of these common institutions, although much more can be done, particularly to ensure access to services in lagging territories of the member states. Far less clear is the nature of the integration challenge to the east. And here is where the conceptual framework developed in the WDR can help. In this map, sorry, I've got my maps mixed up. In this map, you clearly see that between the enormous economic summits of Western Europe and Northeast Asia, there lies a vast economic flatland in relative terms. The trade between East Asia and Europe is enormous, but only a small trickle of it passes through Central Asia and Eastern Europe. The benefits of increasing the flow of this trade through Eurasia and through the Baltic region could be enormous. But as shown here, as we move farther east, the challenges of economic integration posed by geography become greater and greater as the colors of the map get darker and darker. For Central and Eastern Europe, further development of common institutions that unify should be the priority. For Southeastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Russia, institutions need to be complemented with connective infrastructure. And in Central Asia, spatially targeted interventions will also be required to complement institutions and infrastructure. To close, by starting with this simple rule of an I for a D, policymakers will find that growth will still be unbalanced and that economic activity will continue to concentrate in just a few places, because that is the very nature of rapid economic growth. But they will also find that they will make development far more inclusive. For today's developing countries, governments will almost certainly not succeed in making development painless, but they'd probably make it worth the pain. Thank you.